In January 2025, 36-year-old Sammy J. Schaefer Jr. of Caseyville was charged with arranging the killing of 32-year-old Portia Rowland. The allegation placed one central question at the center of the case, a question that guides every stage of the story. What happens when someone tries to create moral distance by paying another person to commit violence on their behalf? Portia Rowland lived in Collinsville, Illinois. On the morning of January 21, 2025, she stepped outside her home to start her car before leaving for the day. It was a routine moment, one that carried no sign of danger. According to police reports, that routine ended when gunfire erupted outside her residence. Rowland was shot multiple times and died from her injuries. Officers responding to the scene found no evidence of a random attack. The location, timing, and method all pointed toward a targeted killing. From the earliest hours, investigators focused on intent. Who wanted this to happen, and who benefited from it? That focus led detectives away from chance encounters and toward personal relationships. Authorities say Rowland was in a relationship with Sarah Schaefer, the estranged wife of Sammy J. Schaefer Jr. Prosecutors allege that Schaefer viewed that relationship not as a private matter, but as a personal loss he could not accept. The state's theory does not rely on sudden rage. It relies on decisions. Those decisions, prosecutors say, unfolded through planning rather than confrontation. Schaefer is accused of choosing distance over direct action. Instead of confronting Rowland himself, authorities allege he sought to remove her through payment and delegation. This is where the governing question sharpens. Outsourcing violence can feel like separation. The law views it as authorship. According to charging documents filed by the St. Clair County State's Attorney, Schaefer is accused of arranging a murder-for-hire plot involving two other men, Gary D. Johnson, identified as the alleged shooter, and Marty D. Shaw, accused of assisting and driving during the attack. Prosecutors say Schaefer promised and paid money to ensure the killing occurred. The amount cited in court records totals $10,000. The alleged structure of the plan matters. This was not a vague request or an impulsive suggestion, according to investigators. It involved communication, coordination, and confirmation. Each step required agreement. Each step reinforced the idea that the person requesting the violence believed responsibility could be shared, delayed, or diluted. The case challenges that belief. After the shooting, investigators began tracing connections. Surveillance footage, phone records, vehicle movements, and financial transactions were examined. Witness statements placed individuals in specific locations at specific times. Detectives say these elements did not exist in isolation. Together, they formed a chain. That chain, prosecutors argue, led back to Schaefer as the person who initiated the plan. By late January 2025, formal charges were filed. Schaefer was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of solicitation of murder for hire. Johnson and Shaw were also charged, facing their own counts tied to the killing. Prosecutors emphasized that the charges reflected alleged roles rather than speculation. The legal framework treats the organizer and the shooter as equally responsible for the outcome. At this stage, the case does not reset into a new story. It deepens the same one. The question of moral distance becomes clearer. Did payment create separation, or did it create evidence? Investigators say the answer is the second. Every message sent, every transfer made, and every agreement reached added material that could be documented, reviewed, and presented in court. Law enforcement officials involved in the case have described murder-for-hire plots as unusually fragile. They depend on secrecy but require communication. They depend on trust but involve people with competing interests. In this case, prosecutors argue that the very act of involving others accelerated exposure rather than preventing it. Portia Rowland's death also shifts the story from theory to consequence. She was not part of the dispute as law enforcement defines it. She was living her life when the plan reached its final stage. Her home became a crime scene. Her absence became permanent. The attempt to manage harm through distance did not reduce harm. it expanded it. As court proceedings began, the focus remained on documentation and process. Prosecutors outlined timelines. Defense attorneys prepared to challenge the state's evidence. Judges addressed custody and procedural matters. Throughout these steps, the central moral question remained unchanged. Hiring violence does not remove responsibility. It formalizes it. The legal system treats the decision to arrange a killing as a completed moral act, regardless of who pulls the trigger. That principle sits at the heart of this case. Prosecutors argue that Schaefer's alleged role did not end when money changed hands. It began there. As the case continues through the courts, it remains unresolved in a legal sense. All defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty. What is resolved, however, is the framework of the story. This is not a tale of chaos or randomness. It is a case built around choice, delegation, and the false comfort of distance. The second case gets more heartbreaking. Let's get into it. But before we do, please help these stories reach more people by simply liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you very much. Now to the second case. A phone call sets a time without names attached. A car waits where it will not draw attention. Money was discussed indirectly, framed as help or a favor. A normal afternoon was chosen because it looked safe. These fragments come first because the killing of Yesenia Jessica Torres did not begin in a parking lot. It began months earlier in quiet decisions, repeated contact, and deliberate observation. For those following the case, the absence of immediate explanation reflects how investigators themselves encountered it, piece by piece, without a clear label at the start. Yesenia Jessica Torres was a 44-year-old businesswoman living and working in San Bernardino, California. On January 10, 2025, she went to a local restaurant during the day. The visit was routine. The location was familiar. After finishing her meal, she walked back outside toward her vehicle. In the parking lot, a man approached her. There was a brief physical struggle. He grabbed her purse. Then he fired multiple shots. Torres was killed at the scene. In the hours immediately after the shooting, the incident was publicly described as a robbery. The visible elements supported that assumption. A purse had been taken. The confrontation happened quickly. Parking lots are common sites for theft. But as detectives from the San Bernardino Police Department began to examine the details more closely, the explanation started to weaken. Investigators noted that the struggle appeared limited and purposeful. The shooter did not act like someone searching for property or reacting impulsively. His focus was narrow. The purse grab, authorities later said, appeared intended to create the appearance of an opportunistic crime rather than to obtain valuables. This distinction became central as the investigation deepened. Surveillance footage from surrounding areas was reviewed. Witness statements were re-examined. Patterns began to emerge that did not fit a spontaneous robbery. Federal authorities, including the FBI, joined the investigation to assist with phone records, location data, and financial analysis. The focus shifted away from a lone offender and toward coordination. What followed was not a single revelation, but a series of fragments. Phone records showed repeated communication among individuals connected to Torres and to one another. Location data placed suspects in proximity to her movements, not just on the day of the killing, but over an extended period. Investigators determined that Torres had been followed and monitored for months before her death. Prosecutors alleged that her routines were studied, her locations tracked, and her schedule observed to identify a moment that would appear ordinary. That finding changed the understanding of the case. The parking lot was not chosen at random. The timing was not accidental. The normal setting was part of the strategy. According to charging documents and statements released by the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office, prosecutors alleged that Torres's estranged husband initiated the plan to have her killed. At the time, the couple was involved in a contentious divorce. Investigators say disputes over money, control of assets, and shared business interests were central to the conflict. As Torres moved toward financial and personal independence, prosecutors allege that the dispute escalated beyond legal resolution. The alleged plan relied on separation and delegation, Authorities identified a structured network of individuals, each allegedly assigned a specific role in the execution of the crime. Juan Perez, 42, a business associate of Sergio Reveles, is accused of serving as an intermediary who helped connect planning to action. Reynaldo Ruelas, 37, an employee at a property owned by the couple, is also alleged to have acted as an intermediary, assisting with coordination. Arnoldo Ruelas, 54, is accused of serving as the getaway driver, responsible for transporting the shooter away from the scene. Gerardo Llamas, 31, is identified by prosecutors as the alleged shooter. Authorities say Llamas fired 9 rounds during the ambush, striking Torres fatally. This division of roles is a defining characteristic of murder-for-hire cases. Responsibility is spread across multiple people. Distance is intentional. The person accused of ordering the killing is not present. The person accused of carrying it out does not have a personal relationship with the victim. Intermediaries create layers designed to reduce direct exposure. In early February 2025, search warrants were executed as investigators closed in on the alleged network. Those searches produced significant physical evidence. Authorities reported seizing more than $286,000 in cash and multiple firearms. Prosecutors alleged the cash supports claims of financial motivation and payment arrangements tied to the killing. The firearms added context to the level of preparation and access involved. By February 2025, 5 men were formally charged in connection with Torres's murder. The charges include murder with special circumstance allegations, such as financial gain and lying in wait. Prosecutors allege that the purse grab and brief struggle were deliberate acts meant to support the initial robbery narrative. All 5 defendants have pleaded not guilty and are being held without bail as the case proceeds. The allegations remain unproven until tested in court. For those following the case, the progression has been methodical rather than dramatic. Each development narrowed the range of explanations. Evidence of stalking reframed the timeline. Digital records replaced speculation. Financial seizures grounded motive in physical proof. The story did not change suddenly, it sharpened. Digital evidence has been central throughout the investigation. Phone records established timing and frequency of communication. Location data placed individuals in relation to Torres over months, not just minutes. Surveillance footage confirmed patterns of movement. Financial records provided context for alleged incentives. None of these elements alone explained the crime. Together, they formed a structure. What this case leaves behind is not resolution, but a pattern. Planning hidden inside routine, violence masked as coincidence. As one investigation closes in, others remain unfinished. The methods repeat. The settings change, and the next story begins not with a crime, but with decisions made quietly, long before anyone is watching. Here's how Case 3 unfolded. Snowboarding is often described as a sport of freedom. It is speed without walls, movement without confinement, risk taken for exhilaration rather than harm. Professional riders travel the world chasing snow, learning discipline, balance, and control under pressure. At its highest level, the sport demands planning, precision, and the ability to make fast decisions with lasting consequences. For most athletes, those skills stay on the mountain. According to U.S. prosecutors, one former professional athlete carried that same mindset somewhere else. Ryan Wedding competed for Canada as a snowboarder at the 2002 Winter Olympics, a period when his public identity was tied to competition, training, and international events. Federal authorities now allege that years later, he became the leader of a transnational cocaine trafficking organization, an operation that relied on planning, hierarchy, and control. By 2025, prosecutors say, the discipline once used in sport had been redirected into managing risk inside organized crime. That alleged transformation matters because it frames the motive behind a killing that took place far from courtrooms and headlines. U.S. charging documents identified Jonathan Acevedo Garcia as a federal witness, cooperating in an expanding criminal case tied to Wedding's alleged organization. His cooperation was not brief or symbolic. Prosecutors describe it as sustained and meaningful. the kind that could clarify leadership roles and connect decision-making at the top to activity on the ground. As long as that cooperation continued, the legal pressure on the alleged organization did not ease. At first, investigators say, the risk appeared manageable. Geography provided distance. The witness existed within sealed filings and investigative timelines, not in direct confrontation. In many complex cases, this is the stage where threats are acknowledged intellectually but not emotionally. The system is watched. Options remain open. As the case progressed, that balance changed. According to prosecutors, Acevedo Garcia continued cooperating as charges expanded. The threat no longer felt abstract. It became central. Federal filings suggest this is where the internal calculation narrowed. If the witness remained active, uncertainty remained active. And uncertainty, within the logic of organized crime, is instability. Authorities allege that the decision that followed was not driven by impulse or anger. It was framed as prevention. Violence was not chosen because it was dramatic, but because it was final. Prosecutors argue that this reframing, where responsibility is shifted onto circumstance and the justice process itself, is common in murder-for-hire cases tied to enterprise-level crime. Importantly, Wedding is not accused of carrying out the killing himself. Federal indictments allege that he relied on intermediaries to arrange logistics, identify local actors, and coordinate an attack without requiring his presence. Delegation served multiple purposes. Strategically, it reduced exposure. Psychologically, it created distance. The act could be treated as an operation rather than a confrontation. That decision reached its endpoint on January 31, 2025, inside a restaurant in Medellin. Jonathan Acevedo Garcia was seated and eating when multiple assailants entered the establishment. Court documents describe a targeted attack carried out quickly and deliberately. The assailants identified him, fired repeatedly, and left within seconds. There was no dispute, no exchange, and no attempt to disguise intent. Colombian authorities later classified the killing as a planned hit rather than a spontaneous act. Federal court records further allege that, after the killing, Wedding circulated images of the victim to associates, presenting the act as proof of enforcement and deterrence. Prosecutors argue this behavior reinforces their claim that the killing was not only intentional but communicative, designed to send a message within the organization rather than resolve a personal conflict. The government's case goes further. Federal indictments allege that Wedding's former attorney, Deepak Paradkar, advised him that eliminating the cooperating witness could lead to the collapse of the U.S. prosecution. Prosecutors say this advice is central to their obstruction theory, positioning the killing as a calculated attempt to interfere with the justice process rather than an act of retaliation. Within days of the shooting, U.S. officials publicly confirmed that Acevedo Garcia had been a federal witness. The United States Department of State condemned the killing and linked it directly to an ongoing U.S. prosecution. This was not treated as a local homicide. It was framed as an attack on the federal justice system. Rather than weakening the case, authorities say the murder intensified it. Federal prosecutors folded the killing into a broader indictment, alleging that Wedding led a criminal enterprise involving drug trafficking, conspiracy, and murder for hire. 10 alleged co-conspirators were arrested in connection with the network, illustrating the scale prosecutors say was required to coordinate violence across borders. From a legal perspective, the killing became evidence of leadership and intent. Prosecutors argue that ordering a witness's death demonstrates authority within an organization and willingness to use lethal force to obstruct justice. In enterprise prosecutions, that pattern matters. It helps establish hierarchy, control, and decision-making power. Wedding did not appear in custody. In March 2025, the Federal Bureau of Investigation placed him on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. The FBI described him as armed, dangerous, and capable of directing violence through associates. The reward for information leading to his capture was increased to as much as $15 million, reflecting the priority authorities placed on the case. For much of 2025, U.S. officials stated they believed Wedding was in Mexico and potentially under protection connected to the Sinaloa cartel. More recently, some security analysts have questioned that assessment, pointing to internal instability and shifting alliances within cartel structures late in the year. As of now, authorities say his precise location remains unknown. Psychologically, prosecutors describe the aftermath as the final stage of escalation. The act intended to restore control instead produced exposure. International scrutiny increased. Law enforcement coordination expanded. The killing became a focal point rather than a solution. Jonathan Acevedo Garcia's death illustrates how murder-for-hire cases function in the modern era. The violence itself is brief. The decision behind it is prolonged. Emotional reactions are filtered through calculation. Fear is translated into strategy. Responsibility is distributed across layers of separation. What makes the case unsettling is not only the attack in a Medellin restaurant, but the internal logic prosecutors describe leading up to it. By the time the assailants entered the room, the outcome had already been accepted elsewhere. The debate was over. The decision had been made. According to U.S. authorities, Acevedo Garcia did not die because of a sudden dispute or a moment of chaos. He died because a former professional athlete, once defined by competition and discipline, allegedly concluded, step by step, that silence was worth more than a human life. In murder-for-hire cases like this, that quiet conclusion is often the most consequential moment of all. The fourth case follows a more devastating path, where control becomes the motive and silence becomes the goal. If you've watched to this point, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Let's jump right into case number 4. Eddie Jawad survived. That is the outcome that frames everything else. In October 2025, Jawad was shot in his own driveway in Macomb Township, Michigan, and lived. Because he lived, the story did not begin with speculation about motive after death. It began with arrests, court filings, and a criminal case that exposed how close calculation came to success. Only after the consequences were already visible did the full context emerge, step by step. By the time prosecutors spoke publicly, the damage had already spread outward. Jawad was recovering from a gunshot wound to his leg. 3 people had been charged. Investigators were no longer asking whether the shooting was planned, but how long the plan had been forming. The legal outcome appeared first: 3 defendants, each charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, a charge that carries a potential life sentence. What followed was an effort to explain how a workplace relationship evolved into an alleged murder-for-hire plot. The shooting itself occurred on October 14, 2025, but surveillance footage later showed the violence did not begin when the shots were fired. It began nearly 45 minutes earlier. According to investigators, the shooter arrived at Jawad's home well before the ambush and hid underneath a vehicle parked in the driveway, remaining concealed for close to 3/4 of an hour. The footage captured the stillness. No confrontation, no argument, just waiting. This detail altered how investigators understood the crime. The attack was not hurried or reactive. It was patient, controlled, and dependent on precise timing. When Jawad exited his home and entered his vehicle, the shooter emerged from hiding and fired multiple rounds as Jawad pulled out of the garage. Glass shattered. Jawad was struck in the leg but managed to escape and survive. The shooter fled the scene in a Ford Escape. What looked like a brief encounter was later understood as the final movement of a plan already in place long before Jawad stepped outside. The investigation that followed placed unusual weight on physical details. Police began searching for the Ford Escape seen leaving the area. What narrowed the search was not just location data or traffic cameras, but distinctive markings. Investigators noted brake dust patterns and bird droppings visible on surveillance footage of the getaway vehicle. When officers later located a Ford Escape with matching characteristics, the visual evidence aligned. The markings were consistent enough to strengthen probable cause and connect the vehicle to the shooting. Within days, police arrested Jason Delanta Martin, a 32-year-old from East Point. At first, he appeared to be the sole focus as the alleged shooter, but the outcome again arrived before the explanation. As detectives expanded their inquiry, family ties surfaced. Martin was not operating alone. Richard Huffman, a former employee of Jawad, is Martin's brother. Dawn Huffman, Jawad's longtime office manager, is Richard's wife. The alleged conspiracy, prosecutors argue, was not built on chance associations. It was built on trust, access, and family loyalty. Only after these connections were revealed did the underlying pressure become clear. Dawn Huffman had worked for Jawad for more than 20 years, holding a role that required deep familiarity with company finances and operations. Richard Huffman had also worked for Jawad until August 2025, just weeks before the shooting. According to prosecutors, Jawad began noticing financial irregularities inside his business. Court records allege that more than $100,000 had been taken through embezzlement. Questions followed. Oversight increased, and investigators say the situation shifted from concealment to exposure. This is where cause emerges behind consequence. Prosecutors argue the alleged conspiracy did not form out of emotion in a single moment. It formed out of fear of accountability. Discovery could mean termination, criminal charges, and irreversible financial consequences. According to the prosecution's theory, the solution chosen was not repayment or disclosure, but elimination. Distance was critical. The person under scrutiny would not confront Jawad directly. Instead, prosecutors allege the plan relied on separation. Someone else would carry out the violence. In this structure, each participant had a role. Dawn Huffman allegedly had access and motive tied to financial exposure. Richard Huffman allegedly acted as a bridge, linking motive to action. Jason Martin allegedly carried out the ambush. Prosecutors argue that this division of labor reflects a classic murder-for-hire framework, where responsibility is fragmented in the hope that guilt will be diluted. The law, however, treats agreement and coordination as sufficient. The killing does not have to succeed for the conspiracy to exist. Because Jawad survived, investigators were able to reconstruct the plan rather than speculate about it. Surveillance footage showed the shooter waiting beneath a vehicle for nearly 45 minutes, reinforcing the argument that this was not impulsive. Phone records outlined communication patterns. Financial documents added context to motive. The distinctive markings on the Ford Escape linked the crime scene to the accused. Each piece alone was incomplete. Together, prosecutors argue, they formed a coherent picture. All three defendants, Jason Delanta Martin, Richard Huffman, and Dawn Huffman, now face conspiracy to commit first-degree murder charges. This charge reflects the seriousness prosecutors assign to the planning involved, regardless of the failed outcome. Under Michigan law, conspiracy focuses on agreement and intent, not just the final act. Authorities argue that the waiting period under the vehicle, the coordination, and the attempted escape demonstrate intent beyond doubt. As of early 2026, the case remains active. Preliminary examinations, initially scheduled for late December 2025, extended into February 2026 as evidence was presented and challenged. No verdict has been reached. What is already fixed is the inversion of the story itself. The arrests and charges came first. The explanation followed. What remains unresolved is not only how this plan unfolded, but how often similar calculations stay hidden until they fail. Eddie Jawad's survival exposed one structure of planned violence, but it is not an isolated design. As this case moves through the courts, it opens the door to the next question. How many other arrangements in 2025 followed the same quiet path, without leaving a witness behind? In case number 5, Snapchat was where the pressure surfaced first, and it surfaced fast. In early October 2025, federal prosecutors alleged that messages appeared offering money in blunt transactional terms: $2,000 for information, $10,000 for a killing. The messages did not emerge in isolation. They followed closely after the Brighton Park shooting on October 4, 2025, a moment that intensified law enforcement scrutiny across Chicago. Within 48 hours, those messages would be identified, preserved, and acted upon. The platform mattered. Snapchat is built around the idea that words disappear. That assumption shaped the alleged behavior. According to investigators, the messages were short, numerical, and stripped of emotion. They treated violence as a service to be purchased, not an act to be committed. In this case, the messages did not vanish. They became evidence. This case, involving Juan Espinoza Martinez, is used here as an anchor, not because it represents every murder-for-hire case in 2025, but because it clearly exposes the psychological sequence investigators repeatedly encounter. Every factual detail concerning Martinez himself reflects verified reporting and court rulings current through early 2026. The broader pattern is structural, not speculative. The story unfolds through shared psychological moments rather than a simple timeline. The first shared moment is planning. In Chicago, prosecutors allege Martinez used Snapchat to broadcast intent rather than quietly arrange it. The alleged posts identified a target: Gregory Bovino, widely described as the chief of the U.S. Border Patrol in Chicago and the operational leader of Operation Midway Blitz, a federal immigration enforcement initiative active during 2025. The offers were direct: no narrative, no explanation, just money attached to an outcome. Across other murder-for-hire investigations in 2025, planning took different outward forms but followed the same internal logic. Some suspects tested interest indirectly. Others discussed logistics before naming anyone. Some spoke hypothetically, as if vagueness provided safety. In each instance, planning framed violence as something that could be outsourced and distanced. By intercutting these moments, the structure makes one thing clear. Planning is not driven by emotion. It is driven by the desire to control outcomes while minimizing exposure. The second shared moment is hesitation. In the Martinez case, there is no allegation that a hired killer was secured. Messages circulated, but the process slowed at the point where intent would have needed to turn into action. That pause occurred in the narrow window between October 4th and October 6th, 2025. Federal authorities, already alert following the Brighton Park shooting, moved quickly once the alleged messages surfaced. The timing matters. This was not a long-term investigation slowly unfolding. It was a rapid response to a developing threat environment. Elsewhere in 2025, hesitation appeared in similar ways. Payments were delayed. Responses paused. Plans stalled while risk was recalculated. These pauses were not moral reversals. They were exposure assessments. Placed side by side, these moments reveal the same internal question repeating across cases. Not should this happen, but can this happen without consequence? The third shared moment is justification. Prosecutors allege resentment tied to immigration enforcement, and the visibility of the targeted official played a role in the Chicago case. Visibility changes perception. A person becomes a symbol. A symbol becomes easier to rationalize removing. The fourth shared moment is communication. Snapchat sits at the center of the allegations against Martinez. Prosecutors say the offers were posted openly rather than sent privately to a single individual. That openness reflects a shift seen in some modern murder-for-hire plots. Instead of secrecy, there is broadcast. Instead of careful selection, there is reach. Across other investigations in 2025, authorities encountered encrypted apps, temporary accounts, disappearing messages, and voice notes. Each method promised insulation. Each left traces. This stage is where many plots fail, not because intent disappears, but because communication creates records. Screenshots exist, metadata persists, words become fixed even when they were meant to vanish. The fifth shared moment is intervention. In Chicago, intervention followed quickly after the alleged messages surfaced. Federal agents did not wait for violence to occur. Surveillance and evidence preservation accelerated. On October 6th, 2025, Martinez was arrested and charged with solicitation of murder for hire. No attack occurred. No weapon was deployed. The intervention took place at the level of intent. That distinction is critical. Murder for hire statutes are designed to stop the process before it becomes irreversible. Parallel cases from the same year reveal the same principle. A cooperating witness comes forward. A payment is intercepted. A call is recorded. The outcome hinges on timing, not spectacle. The sixth shared moment is legal narrowing. After the arrest, prosecutors initially sought to introduce allegations of gang affiliation. That effort did not survive judicial scrutiny. On January 15, 2026, U.S. District Judge Joan Lefkow issued a major pretrial ruling barring prosecutors from presenting evidence of Martinez's alleged Latin Kings gang membership or even claims of his affinity for the gang. The judge found insufficient direct proof and ruled that such claims would be overly prejudicial. This ruling significantly reshaped the case. It removed an entire narrative layer and forced the prosecution to focus strictly on the alleged messages, the alleged offers, and the alleged intent. In the same ruling, the judge denied a government request to allow its key witness, identified as Source of Information 1, to testify anonymously. The court ruled that perceived social media threats were not sufficient to override potential prejudice to the defense. These decisions illustrate how sharply serious cases can be narrowed before trial. Public perception gives way to evidentiary limits. The seventh shared moment is anticipation of judgment. The case remains unresolved. The jury trial is scheduled to begin on Tuesday, January 20, 2026, at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in Chicago. That date marks the shift from allegation to examination. Evidence will be tested. Witnesses will be questioned. Conclusions will be reached only through formal process. Other murder-for-hire cases from 2025 entered similar holding patterns. Arrest does not equal resolution. The period between charge and trial becomes its own psychological space. The final shared moment is aftermath without bloodshed. In Chicago, security measures changed around the targeted Border Patrol chief. Routines shifted. Threat assessments remained active. Even without physical violence, the impact was lasting. Moving on to the sixth case, Franklin, Tennessee, is where this case continues to evolve, not as a closed chapter, but as a widening narrative shaped by recurring themes that stretch beyond a single allegation. In 2025, investigators arrested Angelia Angie Solomon, charging the 55-year-old with solicitation to commit first-degree murder after authorities alleged she attempted to hire someone she believed was a hitman to kill her ex-husband, Aaron Solomon. What began as a murder-for-hire investigation has since expanded, drawing in new charges, new alleged conduct, and a deeper pattern that prosecutors argue reflects the same underlying mindset. This story is not best understood through dates alone. Instead, it unfolds through converging themes: control, entitlement, transactional thinking, fear of exposure, and escalation, each reappearing in different forms as the case develops. Prosecutors allege that control sits at the center of this case. In the original solicitation charge, they argue Angelia Solomon sought to control a personal conflict by removing another person from the equation entirely. According to court records, there was no sudden confrontation or public breakdown. Investigators say the alleged actions were deliberate, quiet, and planned. That same pursuit of control, prosecutors now argue, appears again in a separate set of allegations that surfaced later in 2025. In December 2025, a Williamson County grand jury returned a new indictment, charging Solomon with felony criminal simulation and misdemeanor theft. These charges stem from an unrelated allegation that in March 2025, she conspired to defraud Graceworks, a well-known Franklin-based nonprofit organization. While the murder-for-hire case centers on physical harm that never occurred, the new charges center on deception and misrepresentation. prosecutors argue both sets of allegations reflect the same desire to shape outcomes behind the scenes, controlling narratives, transactions, and consequences without confrontation. Entitlement is a quieter force than anger, but one prosecutors frequently identify in complex criminal cases. In the solicitation charge, the state alleges Solomon acted on the belief that she could decide another person's fate. In the fraud-related indictment, prosecutors now allege she believed she could access charitable resources through pretenses. According to the grand jury indictment, Solomon is accused of conspiring to create or use deceptive representations connected to Graceworks in March 2025. Prosecutors allege the conduct amounted to criminal simulation, creating a false impression to obtain something of value, and misdemeanor theft. While the details of the alleged fraud are separate from the murder-for-hire case, authorities argue the underlying logic is similar, the assumption that rules and safeguards could be bypassed. In both cases, prosecutors say the alleged conduct depends on confidence that scrutiny can be avoided, that systems can be manipulated, and that consequences can be delayed or escaped. Transactional thinking connects the two cases more clearly than chronology ever could. In the murder-for-hire investigation, prosecutors allege Solomon treated life as an exchange. Payment was discussed. Future compensation was promised. Her vehicle registration was allegedly offered as collateral. These details, cited repeatedly in early hearings, were presented as evidence that the alleged plot had moved beyond words. In the later fraud indictment, prosecutors allege a similar mindset, that resources could be obtained through constructed narratives and exchanges not grounded in truth. The alleged conspiracy to defraud Graceworks is framed not as a moment of desperation, but as a calculated attempt to extract value through misrepresentation. In both situations, prosecutors argue harm is not incidental. It is an acceptable cost within a transactional framework. Whether the transaction involves money, reputation, or a human life, the thinking remains the same. Fear often operates beneath the surface in cases involving indirect crimes. Prosecutors do not need to prove fear as an emotion, but they often argue it explains why people choose distance over confrontation. In the solicitation case, investigators allege Solomon sought removal rather than dialogue. In the fraud case, prosecutors allege she sought deception rather than transparency. Aaron Solomon, as a former Nashville television anchor, was not an anonymous figure. His public profile added weight to the original allegation. Authorities confirmed he was never physically harmed, but being identified as the alleged target of a murder plot carries consequences that extend beyond the courtroom. With the addition of fraud-related charges, prosecutors now argue the case reflects escalation rather than isolation. What began as one alleged effort to control an outcome expanded into other alleged acts aimed at managing finances and appearances. Each step, the state contends, increased the risk of exposure and the severity of potential consequences. Bond decisions often reveal how courts assess danger and risk even before trial. When Angelia Solomon was first arrested on the solicitation charge, her bond was set at $500,000, reflecting the seriousness of the allegation. As the case progressed, that bond was later adjusted to $250,000, but with strict conditions attached. Court records show that any release would require an ankle monitor, house arrest, and no internet access. These conditions signal judicial concern not only about flight risk, but about the potential for further alleged misconduct. The restrictions were designed to limit communication, movement, and access, factors often central in cases involving planning rather than impulsive acts. Bond is not a verdict, but prosecutors frequently argue that conditions imposed by the court reflect the gravity of the alleged conduct and the need to protect both individuals and institutions while the legal process unfolds. By early 2026, the case reached another critical juncture. Solomon was scheduled for a plea hearing on January 13, 2026, addressing both the original solicitation to commit first-degree murder charge and the newer fraud-related charges tied to Graceworks. This hearing marked the first moment when all allegations converged in a single courtroom setting. Rather than treating the cases as isolated, the court positioned them within one procedural timeline. Prosecutors prepared to address intent, credibility, and pattern. The defense prepared to challenge interpretation, context, and evidence. As of that scheduled hearing, no convictions had been entered. Under the law, Angelus Solomon remains presumed innocent, but the scope of the case had undeniably expanded, reshaping how it would be understood by the court and the public. As we move to case number 7, the connection between 2006 and 2025 did not appear suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by unfinished questions, shifting relationships, and one critical decision that changed the direction of a long-dormant case. In September 2006, Doris Worrell, a 39-year-old mother of 2, was shot and killed inside John's Sports Park in Douglas, Georgia. At the time, investigators believed the killing was targeted, but no prosecution followed. Nearly 19 years later, in May 2025, that same death became the basis for a murder-for-hire case against her husband, John Worrell. The years between those dates are no longer empty space. They are now part of the story the court must examine. On September 20, 2006, Doris Worrell was found fatally shot inside the family business. The circumstances immediately raised concerns. The location was familiar, the timing specific, and there were no clear signs of a random act. Investigators suspected intent early on, but intent alone does not support charges. Evidence must connect suspicion to action, and in 2006, that connection could not be proven. In the early stages of the investigation, law enforcement arrested 2 men, Glidden Rodriguez and Brandon Cage, on conspiracy-related charges tied to Doris Worrell's death. Those arrests suggested investigators were exploring the possibility of a paid arrangement. However, prosecutors later dropped the charges, citing insufficient evidence to move forward. Without proof that could survive legal scrutiny, the case stalled. It was not closed, but it was no longer active in court. As years passed, the investigation faded from public view. Doris's children grew up without clear answers about how or why their mother was killed. The case shifted from a pressing criminal matter to an unresolved file. What remained were lingering doubts and a sense that something about the killing had never been fully explained. During this period, John Worrell's personal life changed significantly. After Doris's death, he left the United States and relocated to Costa Rica. With him was Paula Yarberry, the family's former live-in nanny. Investigators later confirmed that Worrell and Yarberry had been involved in a personal relationship. Over time, she became his partner, and together they raised Doris's children while living abroad. At the time, Worrell's departure and new relationship drew attention, but did not lead to criminal charges. Investigators were aware of these developments, yet awareness alone was not enough to revive the case. Without corroborated evidence tying Worrell to a paid plan, the investigation remained stalled for years. According to authorities, the turning point came only after Worrell's relationship with Yarberry ended. Following their separation, Yarberry chose to cooperate with law enforcement. Investigators have stated that her cooperation was the primary catalyst that allowed the case to move forward in 2025. This cooperation did not consist solely of personal recollection. Officials say the information she provided aligned with parts of the original investigation and helped clarify details that had remained unresolved since 2006. Crucially, law enforcement has confirmed that Paula Yarberry is not considered a suspect in the case. No charges have been filed against her, and prosecutors have not alleged that she participated in planning or carrying out the killing. Authorities describe her role strictly as that of a cooperating witness whose information helped corroborate existing evidence. Her cooperation allowed investigators to revisit older materials with renewed context. Financial records, prior statements, and long-standing gaps from the original case were reviewed again. What once appeared fragmented could now be examined as part of a broader sequence. Investigators say this process reframed Doris Worrell's death not as an isolated act, but as the final step in a longer chain of decisions. Alongside this renewed review, prosecutors also refined their understanding of motive. While early investigations focused primarily on the act itself, later examinations centered on the state of the Worrell marriage in 2006. According to investigators, John Worrell feared losing custody of his children during a potential divorce. Prosecutors allege that this fear played a central role in the decisions leading up to Doris's death. The state now argues that the alleged plan was driven by Worrell's belief that killing his wife would prevent a custody battle he expected to lose. This alleged motive did not surface clearly in the immediate aftermath of the killing. It emerged only after years of examining personal circumstances, legal implications of divorce, and testimony obtained long after the original investigation slowed. Prosecutors now present this fear of losing his children as a key element in explaining why a paid arrangement would have been considered. In May 2025, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced John Worrell's arrest. He was charged with malice murder, felony murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and aggravated battery. Prosecutors allege that Doris Worrell's death resulted from a paid agreement formed in 2006. The nearly 19-year gap between the killing and the arrest is central to the case, not as a flaw, but as context. Murder-for-hire cases often unfold this way. The person accused of arranging the killing is separated from the act itself. Payments can resemble routine financial activity. Conversations may sound ordinary. Responsibility is distributed across people and time. Prosecutors now argue that this separation is precisely why the case took so long to reach court. After the arrest, the legal process became complex. Since 2025, prosecutors have re-indicted John Worrell multiple times. These re-indictments were not based on new allegations, but on corrections to procedural and documentation issues in the charging instruments. As of January 13, 2026, Worrell has entered a not guilty plea for the third time. The repeated pleas reflect adjustments to legal paperwork rather than any shift in the prosecution's underlying theory. Worrell's defense team has also taken steps to challenge how the case proceeds. They have filed a motion requesting that the trial be moved out of Coffee County. The defense argues that nearly 2 decades of local media coverage, combined with sustained online discussion and social media campaigns related to the case, have influenced potential jurors. According to the defense, assembling an impartial jury in the county where the killing occurred may be difficult. Prosecutors dispute that claim, maintaining that public attention does not replace evidence and that the courtroom is the appropriate place to evaluate the facts. As of early 2026, the venue motion remains part of ongoing pretrial proceedings. The prosecution's burden is substantial. They must prove that an agreement existed, that payment or the promise of payment was involved, and that the accused knowingly participated in that plan. The defense continues to deny these allegations and maintains John Worrell's innocence. As the case moves forward, jurors will be asked to consider events spanning nearly 2 decades. They will hear about early arrests that failed, years of silence, a relationship formed after the killing, and a cooperating witness who later chose to speak. They will be asked to decide whether these elements form a coherent and provable account of a murder-for-hire scheme. The case does not close here. It opens a wider pattern. When one delayed decision finally surfaces, it exposes others still hidden by time, distance, or silence. The question moving forward is no longer whether murder-for-hire cases can stay buried, but how many more are waiting for the same moment of reckoning. As we proceed to the 8 case, the plot thickens. One of the most confronting cases was the killing of Thai Kim Tran in Sydney. Tran was taken from her home in the Bankstown area in April 2025. Police allege that masked men forced entry into the residence late at night and removed her against her will. What occurred inside the home and what followed shortly afterward shaped how authorities later described the gravity of the crime. According to investigators, an 8-year-old boy inside the home was struck in the head with a baseball bat during the attack. The child suffered critical injuries and was placed into an induced coma. Police were explicit in their assessment. The child was not involved in any dispute. He was not the focus of any criminal conflict. The assault was used to remove resistance and establish control. For investigators, this was a deliberate act committed during the crime, not accidental harm. Tran was forced out of the house and into the street. Police later said she was made to strip naked in public before being forced into an SUV. Authorities describe this as intentional humiliation designed to overwhelm resistance and assert dominance quickly. Within a short period, the vehicle left the area. Neighbors were left confused and distressed, while police began reconstructing events through witness accounts and physical evidence. The next phase of the crime demonstrated further planning. Police allege that during the period between Tran's abduction and her death, the men involved sent a photograph of her, along with text messages, to her husband. Investigators believe the messages were intended to draw him out, using Tran as leverage. Officers later emphasized that these communications reflected calculation rather than panic. The violence continued to be used as pressure, even after she had been taken. Tran was later killed. Her body was discovered inside a burned vehicle in the suburb of Beverly Hills in Sydney's south. Police believe the killing was connected to organized crime tensions involving Tran's husband, not any activity by Tran herself. Authorities repeatedly stressed that Tran was not alleged to have been involved in criminal conduct. She was targeted as a way to reach someone else. This distinction became central to how police framed the case publicly. As detectives worked through the investigation, they highlighted a defining feature of murder-for-hire operations. The individuals accused of carrying out the violence were not alleged to have personal grievances against Tran. They were described as hired participants. One party benefits from the outcome. Another commits the violence. Others ensure coordination and separation between motive and action. Police say this structure allows participants to believe responsibility is diluted. By August 2025, police arrested the Nguyen, age 29. Investigators allege Nguyen acted as a facilitator rather than a direct attacker. Police say he led the attackers to Tran's door and served as a link between the men accused of carrying out the abduction and a Victorian-based drug syndicate. Authorities described his role as critical to connecting planning with execution. In October 2025, police arrested 3 additional men, aged 20, 21, and 31 or 32. Investigators allege these men were contracted members of a so-called kill crew and were directly involved in the abduction and murder. Due to ongoing legal proceedings and suppression orders, their names have not been released publicly as of January 2026. All 4 accused men were refused bail and remanded in custody. As of January 2026, they remain in custody awaiting further court proceedings. No trial has commenced, and no verdict has been delivered. Under Australian law, each accused person remains legally innocent unless proven guilty in court. Prosecutors have indicated that the case relies on extensive analysis of phone records, encrypted messaging data, CCTV footage, vehicle movements, and financial transactions. Investigators have described the process as slow and methodical, reflecting the seriousness of the charges and the number of defendants. Official updates and verified details are released through NSW police media. Police have also used the Tran case to explain how such crews operate. Investigators allege the men used what are commonly referred to as kill kits. These kits reportedly include disposable clothing, gloves, footwear, and equipment purchased specifically for the crime. The items are not owned beforehand and are discarded afterward. The vehicle used is often not linked to the participants. The victim is frequently unknown to those carrying out the act. Detectives say this approach helps participants create emotional separation. Violence becomes a task completed with tools rather than an encounter with another person. Police have stressed that while this may reduce emotional connection, it does not reduce legal accountability. Each participant remains responsible for their role. As details of the Tran case became public, senior officers made broader observations about what it represents. Investigators said the crime reflected a shift in Sydney's organized crime environment. For many years, police believed there was an informal understanding that families and children were not targeted. According to authorities, that understanding is no longer being followed. Detective Superintendent Joe Dewey spoke publicly about the case, stating that the involvement of family members and the serious injury to a child marked a clear departure from previous limits. He described the individuals involved as driven by payment rather than restraint. For police, the assault on the child demonstrated that long-standing boundaries had been abandoned. Officers have identified several elements of the Tran case as signs of escalation: the public humiliation of the victim, the severe injury to a child, and the use of live communication during the crime showed a willingness to extend harm beyond what had been seen in earlier years. The objective was not limited to killing. It included intimidation and demonstration of control. Throughout 2025, law enforcement agencies reported similar characteristics in other murder-for-hire investigations. These crimes relied on patience, planning, and emotional separation. They were not impulsive acts. They were deliberate operations shaped by payment and perceived advantage. In the Tran case, police have repeatedly emphasized that the harm extended far beyond the original dispute. Targeting relatives and partners as leverage widens the impact of violence. People with no involvement in the underlying conflict are pulled into its consequences. Investigators have described this as one of the most concerning developments they face. As of early 2026, the case remains before the courts. Prosecutors continue preparing evidence aimed at demonstrating coordination, intent, and shared responsibility among the accused. Further details are expected to emerge through future hearings. What remains unchanged is the structure of the crime itself. Murder for hire replaces direct confrontation with delegation. It turns violence into a paid service. It allows participants to believe distance offers protection from blame. The justice system exists to dismantle that belief. The Tran case does not close a chapter. It exposes a pattern that reappears across jurisdictions with different names but similar patterns. Planning replaces impulse. Distance replaces confrontation. Payment replaces restraint. As this case moves forward in court, it becomes a reference point for understanding how similar crimes elsewhere followed the same design, even when the outcomes unfolded in different places and circumstances. The ninth case enters the scene with deeper betrayal. In May 2025, Raja Raghuvanshi entered marriage holding the belief that a wedding begins with trust. It is the hope that the person standing beside you will protect you, guide you, and never place you in danger. Family and friends witnessed the rituals, the vows, and the celebrations that marked the start of a shared life. Like many newly married people, Raja trusted that his life partner would be the one person who would always act in his best interest, especially when the two of them stepped into unfamiliar places together. Soon after the wedding, Raja and his wife planned their honeymoon to Meghalaya. Honeymoons are built on closeness and reliance. In a new place, one partner often follows the other's lead, trusting their judgment about where to go and what is safe. Investigators would later argue that this dependence was not incidental, but essential to how the crime unfolded. Police disclosures later revealed that the plan to kill Raja did not begin during the honeymoon. According to investigators, the murder in Meghalaya was the fourth attempt on his life. Earlier plans had failed, including an alleged attempt in Guwahati and other planned locations connected to the trip. Each failure led to changes in timing and location, not abandonment. By the time the couple reached Meghalaya, investigators stated the intent had already been tested multiple times. The couple stayed near Sohra, also known as Cherrapunji, a region marked by cliffs, dense greenery, and deep gorges shaped by heavy rainfall. On 23 May 2025, Raja and his wife were last seen leaving their accommodation on a rented scooter. When they did not return, concerns spread quietly. The scooter was later found abandoned. Early assumptions leaned toward misadventure rather than crime. Tourists get lost. Phone networks fail. In terrain like this, delays can feel ordinary. Search operations expanded over the following days. Local police, rescue teams, and volunteers searched paths, ravines, and forested slopes. The land resisted quick answers. Then, on June 2, 2025, the search ended in certainty. Raja Raghuvanchi's body was discovered at the base of a deep gorge near Wai Saodong Falls. The location and injuries made clear that this was not an accidental fall. The case immediately shifted from a missing person inquiry to a homicide investigation. Investigators began rebuilding the final days of the trip using both digital and physical evidence. Near Raja's body, police recovered a machete, locally known as a dao, which showed signs consistent with its use in a violent attack. This recovery on June 2, 2025, provided the first clear indication of the weapon used. However, the attack sequence became clearer only weeks later. On June 17, 2025, investigators conducted a detailed crime scene recreation inside the gorge. During this process, a second machete was discovered deeper within the same ravine. Forensic analysis confirmed that two separate machetes had been used by the attackers. Investigators concluded that the fatal injuries were delivered through coordinated strikes involving both weapons. This clarification reinforced the prosecution's claim that the killing required cooperation and planning rather than a single impulsive act. As physical evidence was analyzed, investigators turned their focus to relationships behind the trip. Police examined communications leading up to the wedding and honeymoon. They stated that Raja's wife, Sonam Raghuvanshi, had extensive contact with another man, Raj Kushwaha, before the marriage. According to investigators, Sonam made more than 100 phone calls to Raj Kushwaha prior to the wedding. Prosecutors later described this volume of contact as evidence of coordination rather than coincidence. In June 2025, Sonam Raghuvanshi was taken into custody. Police confirmed that she was apprehended in Ghazipur after surrendering at a roadside eatery. She was arrested on charges including murder and criminal conspiracy. With her arrest, the investigation shifted from questions about geography to questions about trust and intent within the marriage itself. Late 2025 police filings identified the men who allegedly carried out the killing. Authorities named Vishal Singh Chauhan, Akash Rajput, and Anand Kurmi as the three attackers. Police clarified that these men were not professional contract killers. Instead, investigators stated they were friends of Raj Kushwaha, who carried out the killing as a favor, relying on personal loyalty rather than a formal criminal arrangement. According to investigators, this choice reflected the same belief that shaped earlier decisions, that familiarity would reduce risk. Using friends limited exposure to outsiders and depended on trust within a small group. Police argued that this belief was consistent with the broader pattern of the crime. The investigation expanded further. Records confirmed that Lokendra Tomar, Balveer Ahirwar, and Salome James were arrested for their alleged roles in destroying evidence connected to the case. Investigators stated that these actions were intended to interfere with the investigation after Raja's death, showing that attempts to control the outcome continued beyond the killing itself. Each new finding narrowed the distance the plan depended on. Phone records connected individuals across states. Weapons tied actions to specific locations. Witness statements aligned with digital timelines. What was meant to hide responsibility instead clarified it. On October 28, 2025, a court formally framed charges against 5 main accused: Sonam Raghuvanshi, Raj Kushwaha, Vishal Singh Chauhan, Akash Rajput, and Anand Kurmi, under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita (BNS). With charges framed, the case entered the trial phase. As of early 2026, proceedings are ongoing, with evidence being examined through judicial process. What gives this case lasting weight is not only the loss of life, but the alleged misuse of trust at every level. Marriage created access. Friendship created cooperation. Familiarity replaced caution. Investigators argued that Raja trusted his partner to guide him safely through unfamiliar places. That trust, they allege, was exploited repeatedly across multiple failed attempts until one plan succeeded. This case closes with one truth firmly established. Careful planning does not prevent exposure. What began as private decisions became public record through evidence, witnesses, and time. As this story moves into the courtroom, it also opens the door to the final case in this video, one shaped by the same belief in control and the same failure to escape consequence. Here's how the 10th case unfolded. NSW Police Task Force Falcon began tracking this case not through violence, but through language. Investigators say the earliest material they reviewed showed a dispute expressed in personal terms. Messages and conversations reflected emotion, frustration, resentment, and a sense of betrayal. The 27-year-old man who had defected to a rival group, commonly identified in reporting as the KVT or Afghan crew, was initially spoken about as an individual who had broken trust. At this stage, police say the conflict still lived in the human space. It was about loyalty, status, and perceived disrespect. As the months progressed, Task Force Falcon detectives observed a noticeable shift. According to police, names began to disappear from conversations. The defector was no longer discussed as a person, but as a problem that needed to be addressed. Language moved away from why the situation existed and toward how it could be managed. Emotional phrasing gave way to practical discussion. References to betrayal were replaced by references to timing, location, and opportunity. Investigators describe this transition as a key indicator of escalation, the point where moral hesitation starts to erode. Police allege that by late 2025, the language had become openly transactional. Violence was no longer framed as an emotional reaction, but as a task to be delegated. According to investigators, messages did not always name killing directly. Instead, phrasing focused on who could take care of it, what it would cost, and how risk could be minimized. Task Force Falcon has said this indirect language is deliberate. It creates distance. It allows those believed to be organizing the act to speak in logistical terms while avoiding explicit statements. This progression from personal grievance to operational planning is a pattern police say they see repeatedly in murder-for-hire cases. When language becomes procedural, investigators argue, intent has hardened. People are reduced to objectives. Outcomes replace consequences. According to police, this linguistic shift often precedes real-world action, even when no weapon has yet appeared. The investigation led Task Force Falcon to Ali El-Mubayed, described by police as the alleged onshore leader of the Al Madeen organized crime network following the departure of senior figures overseas, including Rafat Al Madeen. In December 2025, police charged El-Mubayed with soliciting and conspiring to murder two men believed to be living around Kogara Bay. Authorities emphasized that no physical violence occurred toward the alleged targets. No attack was carried out. The alleged plan, police say, was interrupted while it still existed in communication rather than action. Context surrounding the investigation reinforced the instability police were monitoring. In June 2025, months before the murder-for-hire charges were laid, El-Mubayed's home in Maryland was shot at shortly after he left to attend court on unrelated matters. No one was injured, but police treated the incident as a targeted attack linked to the same broader underworld conflict. Investigators noted that the same degraded language, the same reduction of people to targets, appeared to be operating across multiple sides of the feud. Additional charges laid against El-Mubayed, including supplying a large commercial quantity of prohibited drugs and recruiting a child to assist in criminal activity, further shaped how police interpreted the communications they reviewed. Investigators allege these charges point to a wider pattern in which individuals are discussed as tools or assets rather than lives. For Task Force Falcon, language became evidence not just of planning, but of moral collapse. As of January 2026, El Mubayad has not been convicted and is entitled to the presumption of innocence. He was refused bail in December 2025, and the matter remains before the court, with a scheduled appearance on February 25, 2026. All allegations will be tested through the judicial process. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more murder documentaries on the channel, please like and subscribe.